sort of self-harm. So if people have a sort of sensitivity around the area, we're not going into sort of the most nightmare side, but heads up for the discussion. Okay, so overview. So as I say, I think I'm going to talk about a particular kind of depression. Futility thinking is a depression that confines our thinking in a certain way. We're likely to report that nothing is worthwhile, it's pointless, the world is futile, and we are particularly resistant to anything that would change our minds, or at least we're resistant to being persuaded out of that view, where perhaps after like just a good day spent in the company with our friends, maybe less likely to hold this kind of normative outlook. This, I think, raises some questions of epistemic justice, partly to do with the sort of resistance of this thinking, and partly to do with some of the particular nihilist-sounding elements to it. And this is, where do we place futility thinkers in the kind of space of reasons? There's ways to position an agent where we can over-agent them, we can ascribe to them too much epistemic agency and do them a wrong by doing that. And of course, we can unagent people by sort of treating them as sources of explanations, but not of normative reasons. How do we avoid doing either of those errors, making either of those mistakes with futility thinkers? So I'm going to talk about two solutions we might have to this, two ways we might position futility thinkers, I think both of which fall into one of these traps. And at the end, I'm going to talk about where I think a more promising solution would lie, which is by focusing on where I think the agency has successfully been exercised, what the implications of that agency are, and thereby what kind of deference is owed. So I think the agency is exercised upstream of our well-being. So in the sort of the space where we get to determine what are our subjective well-being conditions, I think that's where the exercise of agency is at work. I think a certain kind of deference is owed to that exercise of agency, but we can still say something very strange has happened to the shape of someone's agency, epistemic and otherwise, and this can help us figure out where to place someone as an epistemic agent. So a couple of quick, I suppose, exemplars for this. Lolly began to experience major depression. I'd had a job, but I had to quit because I just couldn't do it. I didn't want to get out of bed, and I felt like there was no reason to do anything. I just didn't care. Sometimes I would just sit and cry over nothing, just cry. And from another source, I had now so great a sense of the vanity and emptiness of all things here below that I knew the whole world could not possibly make me happy, no, nor the whole system of creation. When I waked in the morning, my first thought would be, oh, my wretched soul, what shall I do? Where shall I go? And these are reported testimonies from two different people who seem to be experiencing some kind of depression. Lolly very particularly is talking about absent reasons. She needs reasons to go to work. She doesn't need to cry, that just happens. But she seems to be looking for reasons to get up and go to her job and just isn't finding any. Aline, is the second source, was a priest, a minister in North America in the 1800s. He's talking more about meaning, but the vanity and emptiness here, I think, still speaks to reasons to act in certain ways. God has provided meaning and creates meaning, but seems to have kept it all in heaven and not shared any of it. And at this point, Aline just sees, well, without that, he doesn't seem to have much reason to do certain things. And lastly, this one more sort of round us out. One can live only so long as one is intoxicated, drunk with life. But when one grows sober, one cannot fail to see that it's all a stupid cheat. What will be the outcome of what I do today? What I shall do tomorrow? What will be the outcome of all my life? Why should I live? Why should I do anything? If there is in life any purpose which the inevitable death which awaits me does not undo and destroy. This is an attitude particularly towards his, this is Tolstoy, this is an attitude toward his previous experiences of value and beliefs about value that I think is quite telling. So insofar as some views of autonomy and views of agency focus in on us having higher order reasons, or sorry, higher order attitudes about our attitudes, Tolstoy seems to have a pretty coherent view of his previous attitudes, and he rebukes them in a way that I think is probably quite interesting and seems to be exemplary of certain kinds of, under certain views of autonomy. Not necessarily views I'm hugely persuaded by, but I want to just acknowledge that this is partly why it's interesting. It's because this gets through more of the hurdles that some other views might. So what does this tell us? Futility thinking, if you want a quick summary, is a set of beliefs about the normative landscape, beliefs about reasons. Kahane, who wrote quite an interesting paper about nihilism, distinguishes feeling that nothing matters because one is depressed and feeling depressed because one believes that nothing matters. Futility thinking is believing that nothing matters, probably because one is depressed. We might say one believes nothing matters because one feels nothing matters. This is not just a disposition to say nothing matters or to say it's pointless. It's also a disposition to look back askance, the way Tolstoy did it, your previous kind of values, It's a disposition to kind of roll your eyes and feel very put upon when things are expected of you. These I think are sort of the characteristics of this kind of depression. And it feeds into a well-observed phenomenon of depressive inertia. So this is when people in depression just seem less motivated to do things. Motivation dries up, there are fewer things that we're likely to do. A couple of quick relationships here. Futility thinking is not the same thing as axidy. Axidy is a concept with its roots in scholasticism, where we're mostly familiar with the crazier. I have my all things considered judgment that I should do a certain thing, but I'm more motivated to do something else. That's Socratic action. Axidic action is, or in this case, axidic inaction, is when I have motivating reasons, or I have apparent judgments about what I should do. Things seem good and worthwhile to me, but I have no motivation behind it. Futility thinking isn't quite the same as this. It's perhaps on the far side of axidy, because we don't seem to have those apparent senses of why we should do things that fail to motivate. We just don't have any states that would pretend motivation. It's also not specifically the same as practical nihilism, or at the very least, I think we should treat them differently. Futility thinking is what we're calling a normative outlook. It's something to do with the eyes with which we see the world, whereas philosophical positions like practical nihilism, so that's a view that we just don't have reasons to act or emote in certain ways, at least demands to be treated as a philosophical position and the product of judgment, whereas futility thinking doesn't necessarily. So quickly on that distinction, a normative outlook is a way of seeing the world that makes reasons apparent to us. So Alvarez has this view of reasons as facts viewed in the light of a good, or viewed in the light of a particular kind of evaluation. One thing we could think is evaluations or taking something as good or bad gives us the kind of ultraviolet light under which we can see the normative properties of things. The normative outlook are those kind of ultraviolet light conditions. They are the ways we become sensitive to the normative properties of things. And futility thinking is a normative outlook according to which none of these normative properties show up. None of them are sufficiently good reasons to do certain things. And part of the reason we might think this is really quite unlikely to change, it's quite resistant, is rooted in some of Ratcliffe's work on existential feelings. So Ratcliffe suggests that there are these very, very basic pre-intentional feelings. So these are feelings that don't have an intentional object, but that it gives structure to the intentional states we can have. So however we want to present the world, however the world is presented to us, is scaffolded in some way by these underlying feelings. And he gives examples of sort of deep guilt or radical hopelessness, or indeed radical hope. These are, we think, more fundamental feelings that give structure to some of our intentional states. And it makes it really, really difficult for a person in particular kinds of depression to not feel guilty, because there's nothing for them to be guilty about. Guilt just pervades their being in the world because it's a feature of this, that the foundations of their intentional states rather than of any particular intentional state. The one thing to bear in mind, however, is that these existential feelings scaffold some intentional states and neglect to scaffold some others. So it's simply not possible to have certain intentional states. We can't really believe certain things because they're not facilitated by these underlying existential feelings. So Ratcliffe talks about the hopeless person or the guilty person saying, the person who feels guilty saying, I might recover. They believe that a person who lacks some property H could come to have property H, and that person might as well be them. But that's a very disengaged, lottery-like way of believing something. It doesn't feel viscerally real to them. And when they interact with themselves and make a judgment, the self they're interacting with is not how they're filling the value I. That's still some agent. So that's a kind of disengaged way of having these beliefs. So a normative outlook, futility thinking as a normative outlook, I think is this fairly robust way, or fairly resistant to change way of seeing the world and seeing its normative properties that probably isn't going to change, largely because the intentional states that are absent are just not facilitated by our kind of underlying existential feelings or something similar. So why is this a problem for us? This creates a problem because we're looking at someone's normative outlook, the normative outlook that makes reasons apparent to them, and thereby seems quite important for their epistemic agency. If we are to take them as sources of reasons, possible sources of knowledge about themselves, knowledge about their own well-being, potential sources of knowledge about just the normative universe in which we live, the fact that they have this quite resistant to change outlook that makes certain normative properties not show up for them seems like it might be a kind of epistemic handicap. The question then is, where do we position futility thinkers? We could do them two different kinds of injustice if we're not quite careful. One is simply unagenting them. Say, well, look, you can give us explanatory reasons, but you can't give us potential justifications, to borrow the language from the era projects thesis, what we could say is, well, the person says everything's pointless, nothing's worthwhile. Tolstoy told us that you have to be drunk with life to think there's a point. They're not actually telling us anything about the normative universe we live in. They're just telling us that they're depressed. They don't maybe realize that's what they're telling us, but what we've got is an explanation for that utterance and an indicator about their brain chemistry, but we've not heard them say anything that we can take as reason to believe things about the normative universe. They're not engaging in a discussion about normativity here. This is unagenting. This is simply to treat someone as an explanatory resource rather than someone who's giving reasons. But there's a separate kind of injustice, which is when we over-agent someone. We ascribe to them more epistemic agency, or indeed other kinds of agency, than they could reasonably be expected to have. 8-year-olds in my native Scotland can be held culpable for crimes, can be tried in courts of law, as Ludmira reminded me is probably the key example of this kind of over-agenting. In England, I think it's 10, and we hear in North America sometimes minors tried as adults. The courts, children cannot be tried for certain crimes, so we'll create a legal fiction according to which this person is an adult so that we can try them for certain crimes. This does seem to be over-agenting. This is ascribing a lot of practical and epistemic agency to someone that they probably couldn't have. That's another kind of injustice. And I think the reason this matters, the way this problem expresses itself, is in how people who experience this kind of futility thinking interact with themselves, they interact with others, and how third parties will sort of view them. So from the third person perspective, just making sense of behavior, or in this sense, absent behavior, making sense of inertia can be quite difficult. Questions about what's good for the agent become difficult, insofar as at least the subjective part of our well-being is kind of up to us. It's what we care about makes us vulnerable to harms and susceptible to goods because of what we care about. Coming to not care about anything does something plausibly quite weird to our well-being. We need to know, okay, has this person successfully governed their well-being in that way? What does that look like? So these sort of questions from the third person point of view kick in. Also for things like, do we intervene? There are certain kinds of depression for which we should let people have a bit of space, a bit of time to decompress. But at a certain point, that's not self-care anymore. We should maybe impose our company on our friends, because isolation will just get you into that death spiral. And so what we need to do is impose our company to interrupt that process, because the person can't really interrupt it themselves at this point, or at least they're very unlikely to. Questions like, when to hospitalize someone and when Ulysses contracts kick in are also quite relevant here. And there's also this is purely the sort of third person perspective. How do I act upon the person engaged in futility thinking? More importantly, how do we interact with people when they are engaged in this kind of thinking? Questions like, how do I help you? Well, I could be sorely mistaken about that if you ask me, particularly if I'm in a depressive state. The sort of cartoon here is one I'm really quite fond of. It's a sequel to a cartoon in which the depressed wolf is having a self-care day where they're looking after themselves. They haven't got out of bed, and the friend asks them, okay, can I get you anything? He says, bring me 12 more pillows and a box of chocolates, which felt sort of reassuring to people. Like audiences look at that cartoon and feel that they have permission to have a day where they're not very productive, which is useful. But the follow-up is to point out that staying in bed for a couple of days at a time is not actually self-care. Like this is these symptoms of getting really quite unwell masquerading as self-care. We can be desperately misguided about what our own good is at certain times. And therefore, when third parties are asking us, how do I help you? What sort of support do you need? If we're going to be wrong about it matters where we are placed as an epistemic agent. And lastly, there's a question from the first person perspective. So if we have one depressive episode in our life and it's not likely to come back, this is less of an issue. If depressive episodes, or indeed manic episodes or something else like that, are just recurrent features of our life, well, I need to know how I'm going to interact with myself when I'm in that state. I need to know how to think about my previous outlooks when I have been depressed. How much credence do I give them? And I need to think about what kind of habits am I going to cultivate in myself? What's my self-management going to look like? How should I train myself to deal with my outlooks? One approach to this, Talia Wayner gives us the example of tentativeness. This is a self-care practice in a particular group of people with bipolar disorder that involves a cultivated suspicion to all of your emotional states all the time, which might be very useful if you're sort of constantly on this war footing with your brain. That kind of suspicion is both understandable and possibly quite reasonable. But one of the people she interviews, the man called James, he's cultured this to such a degree that he just doesn't have any agency left. He can't do anything because every sort of impulse or every sort of motivation he has, he treats with such suspicion it can't go anywhere. And he describes it as a very, very successful exercise in self-care, but laments that he can do nothing with his life. So there's a way this can go quite wrong. We need to understand how to interact with ourselves. And that means we're positioning ourselves as agents, positioning selves at distant times as kind of epistemic agents. So I think this is quite a pervasive question, and we need to get it right. And we need to get it right in quite a few different domains. So a quick summary, what is the problem? Where do we position the epistemic thinker? Where are they in the space of reasons? What kind of agency, what degree of epistemic agency, I should say, do we ascribe to them? We're in danger of unagenting themselves and ourselves at other times. We say, all intentional states are confined by existential feelings. So this is one of the important parts of Ratcliffe's argument. The existential feelings that confine our intentional states are ubiquitous. We're always in a mood, one mood or another. We're always underpinned by some existential feelings. So the simple fact that certain states are unavailable to us doesn't seem to be a defeater, because that's the normal state. That's whatever successful epistemic agency looks like is subject to that restriction as well. So we can't just write someone off and say, well, this is just unagent them on the grounds that they can't reflect themselves out of their depression. That doesn't seem available to us. On the other hand, the danger is overagenting themselves and ourselves. There's a story that Kahane relates of the philosopher Hare, who had a student deeply distressed by reading Camus, and with Camus' suspicion of value. And Hare said, well, clearly things do matter. It matters to you that things matter. This is a linguistic error, and sort of satisfied himself that he'd resolved a language game problem. The solution, of course, is that, the problem, of course, is this didn't make the student feel much better, or it's very unlikely to. We probably can't reason our way out of this. So quickly, what are the two solutions that aren't going to get anywhere? The first one is to defer to the long self, defer to the normative outlooks a person has at other times. So what sort of judgments about value would you make in this context? Frequently, this comes up in medical ethical literature. So Jaworska's 1994 paper, I think it was arguing against something like this view, that we've got these long-term values rooted in much more of our lives in this particular episode. We should defer to them because they speak to the greater self. Okay, we can bite the bullet on this. That is just temporary unagenting. My problem is that this ducks the question, right? That there is no arrival outlook. And I think what Jaworska argued is that, look, the capacity to value is still there in late-stage Alzheimer's. That's got to be what's authoritative. My sort of worry is, I don't know who this long self is. They're kind of a theoretical, they're an imaginary being. I can never interact directly with that entity. And whenever I'm having an interaction with you, I'm not interacting with this long self with values rooted across time. I'm only ever interacting with a snapshot of that self. It would seem strange to me if my respect is owed to that long self I can never quite reach, and never to the person that I meet today or I'm interacting with at the moment. So I think there's undesirable consequences here of unagenting. I think more importantly, this is just duck the question. It's to refuse to accept that another outlook could seem to be doing the work. So I think this is where it sort of ducks the issue. Secondly, we could try and persuade people. There's a kind of movement to use philosophy as therapy. To some extent, there's some versions of this seem to be fairly promising, and I'm happy for as many therapeutic tools to be created as possible. There hasn't been a breakthrough in psychiatric medicine for quite some time, and SSRIs, for many people, just aren't available, and they're just not an available sort of treatment. So if we can get more tools in the toolkit, I'm all for it. But this does sometimes look like Hare's Swiss student of saying, you've got this sort of feeling that value is really unstable and you can't rely on it. That's a sort of error of the language game. We can have this linguistic solution. I just don't think it's going to work. This isn't going to work is my major objection. The existential feelings confine intentionality, and we can't talk someone out of that kind of feeling, or at least if we can, it requires the stars to align in a way that we don't get to rely on. The bullet we're writing here is, if this doesn't work, we're out of legal moves. If we position someone's agency such that we don't get to act towards them the way we might sometimes act towards a friend who's depressed that we're going to impose our company on, if we have to try and persuade you and persuasion isn't going to work, then what does our concern about your well-being look like? It doesn't seem to allow us to do anything. That's kind of my worry in this sort of attempt to persuade. And insofar as philosophy as therapy relies on this, if we're worried about sort of legal moves, the worry here is that there's just suddenly nothing else we could do to look after your well-being. This is sort of us in the trap. So what has the futility thinker done? This is, I think, the solution that I'm sort of working on. I think the futility thinker has formed a normative outlook. They've not made some misstep and failed to form a normative outlook. I think futility thinking is a weird normative outlook. It's structurally weird in addition to being sort of weird in its output, but it is nonetheless a normative outlook. Things that are downstream of our normative outlook include our subjective well-being conditions. So if it just doesn't seem good to me to be autonomous, then it's not clear that autonomy is better for my well-being unless you have included autonomy in your kind of objective list. But if you allow for this sort of like subjective element of well-being, sort of spiritual purity is not valuable to everyone. It's valuable to some people, and they're better off for having it. That's because either they have legislated for themselves what is their good. That might be an action people take. It might just be this downstream effect of having formed a particular normative outlook. So I think one of the things that has successfully been done here is a particular normative outlook has been formed. Therefore, the agent does have self-knowledge. They have determined what their well-being looks like. The well-being conditions just look really weird. So this, I think, is where the epistemic agency is firing correctly. And this is owed a degree of deference. So we can't unagent a person below a certain threshold because this agency is working as intended. There's a new problem. Their well-being conditions look really weird. Possibly there are none. And I think the closest model to this might be newborns who have well-being conditions, but they don't have any subjective well-being conditions. So I think there's a way in which we can say particular kinds of depression just cut us loose. They cut a portion of our well-being just loose in the void. We're badly off, but we're not more vulnerable. We're probably less vulnerable because as much as it's terrible to be in these kind of depressions, your interests, the things you care about collapsing aren't going to make you worse off until you start caring about them again. That's this kind of part of the suspension. You're kind of in this frictionless void. It is kind of why I describe futility thinking more like a normative desert. It's this vacuum of reasons. You don't have reasons to care about the thing, and therefore things you would otherwise care about failing to come to fruition, they're not making you worse off. You're just at this low level. But there's one difference here, which means we don't get to infantilize people engaged in futility thinking. We don't get to unagent them in that way. You still have a normative outlook. You have successfully exercised that agency. And you're in this position because the way in which you've exercised that agency is unusual. And it does this kind of damage to the rest of your agency, to the rest of the sort of structure of your well-being. So we have this sort of difficult position because the successful exercise of epistemic agency has these downstream effects that sort of mess with the rest of our agency, which means we are owed a degree of respect, but our well-being is still kind of worse off. But we're in some ways like the newborn in that it would be better for us if we had formed a different normative outlook. We probably want this person to recover from their depression so they can get a better normative outlook, but they already have one, so we don't get to treat them the way we treat infants. Quick recap. Futility thinking traps us in a kind of nihilist outlook. It's not philosophical nihilism, but it reminiscent of it at the very least. There's this difficult question as to where we position the epistemic agency of futility thinkers, because we could get into two traps quite easily. And the consequences of doing that can be quite serious when we talked about the examples of where this kicks up. You've got enough agency to be sort of in control of your subjective well-being conditions. You've still got control of the levers there and are in fact pulling them appropriately. But you have this truncated space of possible well-being because you have made your agency a bit more, or you've made your well-being a bit more like that of a newborn's. They still have an outlook, so we don't get to infantilize you. We have to have some other kind of interaction. What that interaction looks like, I'm not quite sure yet, but I'm hoping to sort of illuminate that in the future. Sorry, my timer battery died, so I don't know quite how long I've spent on that, but thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Elliot. Your timer died, but your inner timer was perfectly on. You've spoken for 24 minutes. And thank you for your energy. When I saw the title, I thought I was going to divorce Abe forever as co-organizer to put a talk like this at the end of the day, but you were amazing, like how you pulled it off. So lots of interesting things to discuss and to perk us up intellectually. Are there any questions and comments? Hopefully there are. I mean, maybe I can ask a kind of starting question, and obviously Lubomira is the expert on the empirical literature as well as the philosophical side of this. But so how? I mean, so to what extent are these empirical claims, and to what extent are they philosophical claims, right? So when you talk about the outlook, right? So I thought it was amazing the way you constructed this idea of the normative outlook. But to what extent is that informed by the empirical literature?
So I don't want to rely much on the empirical literature for it. There's a way you could construe some of the empirical literature this way. So there's There's work on motivational anhedonia, which seems to be, some people seem to think is perhaps what most anhedonia is. Like, it might be more often the case that motivational anhedonia is at work than experiential. So this is where we actually are capable of experiencing pleasure. We just don't seem to have the ability to anticipate it. And to an extent, I think what I'm describing sounds very much like that. But I don't want to say, like, neurologists have discovered this phenomena to do with like the anticipatory or the motivational dopamine system. Therefore, my philosophical account is true. Mostly, I want to say, look, it's a way of making intelligible, a way of understanding the interior life as reported and the practice as performed and observed of people who just don't do much, who have, as Solomon talks about this quite a lot, have everything going for them, are in the midst of very successful exercises of their agency, doing what they want to do and getting rewarded for it, and suddenly just the push behind that all just evaporates. And then they start reporting the world as cold and indifferent, and as Liam describes, sort of the vanity and emptiness of all temporal things. It's a way of taking together this sort of observed behavior of people, including their speech acts, and rendering it intelligible. They are seemingly committed in some sense to a particular view of the space of reasons in which it is barren.
Thanks, that's super interesting. Okay, I won't go on. I think you've got a question from Michael.
Yeah, thanks very much for that talk, Elliot. I had a question about your objection to this long self solution. So, as I understand it, one of the problems you had with this was that it involves a sort of unagenting, because it involves sort of dismissing the sort of present agent, what you're sort of are currently experiencing. But then, I mean, you might think it's not really unagenting in that sense. It's just sort of recognizing that there's more to you as a person than just your current state of mind. So you often get this sort of advice, this too shall pass. And that sort of recognizing that you're going to sort of remain the same person once you've got through this this current way of thinking or something like that. So I wonder what you think about that sort of idea.
Yeah, thanks. It's quite an important point. I think there's definitely an extent to which the sort of long agency view, we are recognizing that you are more than this current moment, and there's you will contain multitudes. The thing that I think I don't like this as a thing as a response to rely on is particularly in the kind of futility thinking. So if we have acidic depressions where people report that they care deeply about their work and their projects, it can be reassuring to be told that it will pass. But for those certain kinds of depressions, the way kind of Tolstoy described it as, that's just the drunken view. You just need to be intoxicated to really believe that. And once you've seen it properly, you know that it's all a stupid cheat. There's the stickiness of you. So when I talk about the robustness or the unmovability of this futility thinking, one feature of it I should mention is the kind of stickiness. It claims to be a better view. It's why I was sort of focusing on Tolstoy's attitudes towards his previous attitudes, which means the futility thinker is likely to just dismiss that out of hand. Maybe it'll pass, but it doesn't matter if my brain chemistry changes. I have now seen the universe. It's an epistemically transformative change. As Ludmira, you and I were talking about yesterday, it's a transformative change that doesn't stick in most cases, but it does from the inside have this weird status of I have to sort of reject and rebuke these other outlooks. So it's certainly the case that we should not, we shouldn't buy into the kind of nihilism. We should never say, okay, granted, when I'm talking to you, I should assume nihilism is the case because I think nihilism is false. But I think it's important that nihilism is false. But I think the reason I want to, the problem I think there is to say, okay, well, sort of we need you to dismiss your current normative outlook so that you can defer to the sort of longitudinal one, is because it's asking someone who is still exercising their epistemic agency to kind of not do it, or to give up on that last bit of the agency they've got, which I think they're very unlikely to do. And I worry it might not always be it might be the best way for them to get back the rest of their agency, trade them in, possibly, but I think they're unlikely to do it. And I worry that just complete agential collapse lies that way. So I have a number of objections I need to develop more, but this is the direction in which that one's going.
Yeah, thanks for that, Elliot. That's really helpful.
Thanks, Elliot. So next question is from Kat, and then you.
Thank you. So I wanted to ask about the argument that like the reasoning, the philosophical approach doesn't work here, and therefore we need to like think about other approaches and how that jives with the perspective that you have on what's going on in these cases of futility thinking. So is it correct that your view on the futility thinking cases, like at least the ones that you're interested in, is like these are instances in which somebody has the belief that the normative landscape is in fact a desert and therefore is depressed, and not sort of the opposite way?
So Kahane, so the reason I borrowed Kahane's sort of distinction there to try and wedge a little logical space apart, I'm not quite sure I separate them. I think this is probably just this is a way of being depressed.
Okay.
So far as what we recognize as depression doesn't just include low affect. Sometimes it just includes this motivational collapse. You don't need to be sad and tearful to be diagnosed or to be recognized as depressed. So I think this is just one way of being what we call depressed. It's just to have this breakdown in agency.
Okay, yeah, like I think what I'm interested in is like the not necessarily the agency that follows from the epistemic state, but the epistemic state itself. So I think you had expressed some like really significant skepticism about like the value of like, oh well, this is just a linguistic error. You've like that kind of response. And I think my question there is, if it really is just, and I think your answer is probably going to be, it's not just, but like it really is just a case of somebody having a belief, and like, here's what we do as philosophers, we make arguments that we think get to the truth, and we think we have good arguments, and we think it's true that the normative landscape is not a desert. Then in fact, like, one thing that we might be finding when we like try to deploy the philosophical tactic is like, oh, this person actually isn't engaged in futility thinking as characterized this way. In fact, they're just depressed in this other way, which is like something better treated with like SSRIs.
I think I lost you a little bit there. Would you be able to just quickly run me through that again?
Yeah, so the thought is like, and this might just be an incorrect characterization of your view, so I'm also trying to get at the characterization of your view. If there are these cases that we want to call futility thinking, in which the root of the affective stuff is just the belief, the normative landscape is a desert, then it seems like those cases are exactly the kind of cases where the philosophical approach should work if that's what's really going on. So if it doesn't work, either we have bad arguments, or that's not what's really going on. And so I kind of wanted to get your take on like how your pessimism about that approach jives with that view of what futility thinking is.
Okay, excellent, thanks. Yeah, this is quite helpful. So I think the belief that nothing matters or nothing is of value is probably a kind of a generalization made, like you get out of just nothing feeling like it matters. So there is this affective side of like, insofar as if we buy certain views of emotion as kind of like the perception of the normative properties of things, futility thinking seems to, we can't see the reasons to do anything. We can't see the favorable normative properties of things. Possibly we can still see the negative normative properties of things. And we sort of like it's almost like going from perception to belief, basically, on that view of emotions. We can see only a world that is grim. This is why the philosophical approach is unlikely to work, because we're trying to persuade someone that there's the sort of confining effect of existential feelings might be one part of it, where it's just like resistant. But I think something else that's at work here is that we're trying to convince someone against the evidence of their kind of normative eyes. So insofar as this is a change in emotion, and I do subscribe to the set of theories that say emotion is at least partly a capacity to perceive the normative properties of things, it's really quite difficult to persuade someone out of the evidence of their eyes. And if it's something that's you can't even convince someone, or it's hard to explain how this is an optical illusion. It probably is in a sense, but it's like, we can't take the stick out and then show you it at different angles. So I think that's maybe why we're very unlikely to do it, because we're butting heads with this sort of constant reinforcement of the view that the only normative properties to be found are properties to be sort of downcast and grim, reasons to be downcast and grim. Does that sort of answer your question?
I think so. So the thought is like fundamental to this characterization of futility thinking is this like normative perception. And that's where we sort of move forward on the rest of the view.
Yeah, sorry, I probably should have highlighted that earlier.
No, that's really great. Thank you.
Thank you, guys. I need to know that that's needs highlighted.
And our next question is from Gilles.
Hi, thanks. So you may have started to answer a bit of part of my question. I apologize if I just make you repeat some stuff you already said. But so I was wondering if futility thinking is always a depressive state. Or in other words, could some sort of futility thinking be sometimes justified? And if that is the case, then considering it as a depressive state, like, are you already from the get-go undermining the possibility of agency there? And so, yeah, kind of wondering if futility thinking could be considered otherwise as a depressive state, and if that would change kind of the approach you have and the way you conceive how the epistemic injustice can go with that's kind of thinking in the normative outlook. Thanks.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Thanks. So in older versions of this, I didn't focus on depression exclusively. I did sort of talk about some other versions. And I think I wasn't comfortable enough that I had a good enough characterization of futility thinking to include them. So part of it is like, how much are we willing to call depression? So we could narrow what we're willing to call depression to precisely diagnosable episodes according to the ICD-11 or the DSM. We could do that, or we could say, look, there's just this broader thing of like, you're not in an episode, but if you have ongoing depressive symptoms outside episodes, you're going to know what they're like, and you might include this. And then there's a broader one again of just like, there's this general downcastness or listlessness or suppression of agency that we can call a depression for a sort of more expanded value. I don't, on that third one, yes, because that's the most flexible definition of depression, we could, without too much shoehorning, call anything that fits this characterization depressive. I think you're probably right, though, that there are just situations that probably aren't best characterized as depression that might fit here. So I'm thinking of a kind of like ennui or like alienation plus ennui characteristic of, you know, people who like really, really don't like their jobs, but they don't feel like their job should be fulfilling, or they don't like believe that jobs are supposed to be fulfilling, but they have this like constant sense of their job as unfulfilling. And this creates a particular sort of effect. I think that can, to an extent, create this kind of like, well, how do I make sense of all this? How do I make sense of my own behavior? Well, things aren't meant to be fulfilling. There's just not that much reason to seek fulfillment or to do anything. I think to an extent that can be a kind of futility thinking. Insofar as there's a question of like, does this create a sort of agency problem? I don't think so, but I might be wrong. Like if it's pointed out to me more clearly, like I'm open to being persuaded that I've sort of stepped on something here and need to be much more careful with it. I think what we might say is, look, you could run into the same kind of problem that I talk about. So there's a particular kind of like revolutionary anti-capitalist or activist anti-capitalist who like, what we need to do is radicalize people who really don't like their jobs or who are like really unsatisfied with only owning their labor and with the alienation from their labor. And then when they encounter someone who just like, yeah, but it's not like the system's bad, it's just like this is as good as it gets. I think they're likely to do the same thing of, well, this person's so indoctrinated, they're never going to read their Gramsci. And I think that's kind of the same unagenting that I was talking about. There's a version of it in this environment, but I have spent sufficiently long not working in those environments that I don't meet with this kind of ennui as often anymore. So I'm not sure I would want to characterize it very decisively. So in answer to that question of am I doing that, making a sort of agency problem here? No, I think to an extent, some version of what I'm describing kicks up again there in kind of similar shape. I might be wrong about that. My confidence that I'm right here is much closer to 50% than my confidence for the rest of it, but I think not.
Thanks, Elliot. I think we're going to sneak in one more question if people are happy with that. Clarice?
Hi, Elliot. Thank you for your talk. So I just wanted to ask more about your explanation of futility thinking. And you say, like, it results from a depressive state, and we infer from that we feel nothing matters, that nothing matters. I just wanted to ask how a view where something mattering results from our feelings, like our feeling that it matters is what makes it matter. Like just how that would influence what you're saying. Thanks.
Yeah, so I think for a great many of the things that matter, they matter because we feel they matter. And so when I was talking about our normative outlooks being upstream of like our subjective well-being conditions, I think a large part of it is certain kinds of life just seem good to us. We're sensitive to their normative properties, and the normative properties seem to recommend them. That makes that kind of life better for us. There might be a sort of a much more decisive, we are pulling a lever in the sort of, we're exercising a normative power much more decisively somewhere. But I think there's also versions of it which are just very, a sort of roughly causal relationship. What I think futility thinking kicks in is because it's a situation where we kind of don't care about things, where we become so insensitive to so much of the potential goods of life, and to an extent to the potential bads of life. So again, Tolstoy was like, nothing matters. The things that are bad for me aren't that bad for me. Like my suffering, yeah, it's not great, but it's ultimately not that important. Like we don't have very good reasons to care about it. What this then does is just extinguish the well-being conditions, so that our caring about it would make it mattering to us would make it matter. It not mattering to us deprives it of that source of importance. So we're extinguishing that whole category of reasons to do things, or sort of normative properties, by kind of not caring. And it's not that we don't have the capacity to care, or it's not that we don't have certain capacity to make things matter. It's that we have that capacity, and we're sort of exercising it in a way that prevents it from getting the usual outcome, which is why I think it's a bit puzzling in kind of a lot of well-being issues, as well as being epistemically quite strange. Does that kind of answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Elliot, and thank you to all the presenters today. It's been an amazing day for me, at least. We're going to reconvene tomorrow at the same time. Just a quick announcement. Sorry, yes, thank you. Just a quick announcement. We're going to have a shift in the program because Martel is sick. I will email everyone, so everyone's just going to move one place up. Gilles and Kat have kindly agreed to do so. I will email all the participants, and Abe will email the registered people. Thank you very much, and I wish you all a lovely evening, and looking forward to another day tomorrow. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome.